Hey guys, welcome back to Intelligent Faith 315. This is Pastor Jay. Glad to have you with us. If you are watching this video on our YouTube channel, I encourage you to go to intelligentfaith315.com. It's our mother website. You can open up another tab in your browser. Got a lot of articles, a lot of good posts, videos, links over there. I encourage you to check that out. You can subscribe to intelligentfaith315.com through email, through the RSS feed, or by clicking on the Google Friends icon. Today, guys, we're going to be continuing with a series that we began just a short while ago called Good Arguments for God's Existence. Now, I don't know if any of you guys are very familiar with this. We did a short introduction. We had a two-part introduction to natural theology, because natural theology is really the area that concerns itself with giving rational and reasonable arguments for God's existence. Even if you're unfamiliar with this, as a Christian, perhaps, natural theology has a rich and colored history all the way back to the beginnings of the New Testament church. So really do encourage you to check out the works of St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, Bonaventure, and a whole bunch of other authors. Natural theology has even been prominent with Jonathan Edwards, and of course modern day authors, especially like Dr. William Lane Craig, Dr. Alvin Plantinga, Dr. J.P. Moreland, Dr. Paul Copan, great thinkers like this, Dr. Norman Geisler. So we're going to begin to now get into some very interesting and popular arguments for God's existence. Now, it's not just natural theology. These arguments are actually philosophical arguments that demonstrate God's existence. Now, don't let that intimidate you if you've never really been into philosophy. Philosophy, or philosophia, simply means the love of wisdom. You could also say the love of truth or the love of knowledge. So this is basically just taking a deductive syllogism, which is basically a couple of premises and a conclusion, and through reasoning, just going back through certain lines of thinking and reasoning back to the existence, that the conclusion that's the most probable is that a creator, personal God does exist. So it's philosophical in that sense, but it's not, tremendously complicated. Don't be intimidated by that. If this is new to you, please stick with us. The reason I want you to do that is for a couple of reasons. These are very short arguments, the majority of them. They're very easy to memorize. Everybody, in a sense, is a thinker, some to greater extents than others, right? And so, to a certain degree, this can reach out to everybody. You may not be able to reach everybody with scientific apologetics. You may not be able to reach everybody with historical or archaeological apologetics, things like that. But the benefit that philosophical or classical apologetics has is that it's just using simple rationale, simple reasoning, simple thinking, and in that sense, that's common to all men. And so it's very relatable, it's very easy in that sense to use it as a great tool of communication when you begin to talk with people and dialogue. Another interesting reason why I love this form of apologetics is for the following reason. Everybody, in some sense, has a philosophy. Everybody, in some sense, is a philosopher. Why do I say that? Well, if you define philosophy or philosophia as the love of wisdom, the love of truth, the love of knowledge, everybody is engaged in believing some truth or some belief regarding reality. If you have a set of beliefs, if you have a worldview, if you have some kind of a general framework, a thought framework, a philosophical outlook on life, well, then that's your philosophy. Even if you're a person that says, well, I don't have a philosophy, that's your philosophy. And so it's a really interesting aspect that everybody, to one degree or another, is in some sense a philosopher. So there's a high degree of relatability that you can use these arguments for with people. Another reason why I really like philosophy is because of this. Philosophy is, of course, its own major area of study. In other words, you could go to a university, to an undergraduate, a graduate program, and you can actually major in philosophy. I'm actually in the process of trying to enter into the master's track program for Christian philosophy and apologetics at Columbia Evangelical Seminary. So you can actually specialize in philosophy per se as its own separate discipline. But philosophy, you see, is not just a first-order discipline, its own separate subject. Philosophy is also a second-order discipline because it underlies every other area of study. What I mean by that is this. If you are a scientist, you may not be aware of this, but there is a philosophy of science. Even if you aren't aware of it, you do possess a philosophy of science. Even if you are a historian and may not realize this, you have a certain philosophy of history. There's a philosophy of business, a philosophy of ethics, philosophy of mathematics. And so philosophy is very unique in this sense. It is a second-order discipline to every other subject of study that we know of. And then in addition to that, it is its own first-order discipline all by itself. And so that, to me, makes philosophy incredibly, incredibly powerful, incredibly potent, and incredibly effective. It's relatable because it just involves simple, logical, rational thinking, but it's also very, very potent. Why? Because when you're talking with, let's say, an evolutionist, let's say an atheist who believes in Darwinian evolution, well, you could kind of approach that in two different ways. You could take door number one, and you could speak to him on the level of science, biological evidence, biological design, astronomical design features, the physical constants of nature. You could speak with him about those particular aspects of science that run up against evolution, right? That don't really jive with evolution. You could talk about the subject in that sense, or you could take a totally different approach, and instead of talking about the scientific details themselves, you could go underneath that, and you could talk about the more fundamental aspects of the philosophical ideas that this person holds that support his worldview, that support his perspective that there is no God, that he believes in, let's say, naturalism or physicalism or materialism, that there's only physical objects in the world, that the only way that we can really know truth about reality is through, let's say, chemistry and physics. But what you'll discover is that the philosophical beliefs that people use to, let's say like this, hold up their worldview, the philosophical beliefs down here are often very weak. And if you can begin to peel away the philosophical beliefs of a person and just help them understand that those philosophical presuppositions or ideas are very weak, guess what you can do? Well, just like if I was holding this up and you pulled away my fingers one at a time, what would happen? Well, my Kindle, my beloved, beautiful Kindle here, would come crashing down. And this is what happens. In my opinion, you can actually help dismantle lovingly, gently, and very graciously. You can actually dismantle a person's worldview by going underneath and examining the philosophical weaknesses that they have. And pretty soon, if they're consistent, if they are honest, their worldview will fall, and they'll recognize, wow, I really need to get a new worldview. I really need to get a new perspective, a new philosophy about life. If atheism won't do it, if pantheism won't do it, maybe theism presents a more consistent and livable worldview. Maybe actually Christian theism will do it. So I just encourage you guys, if you haven't really delved into much of this before, I really do encourage you to get into some classical apologetics or philosophical apologetics, and that's a little bit of what we're going to be touching on as we now get into good arguments for God's existence. We're going to begin with a certain family of arguments, and these are called the cosmological arguments for God's existence. As I mentioned a couple of videos ago, and I better get into this pretty quick because I'm talking a lot as I usually tend to do. There's different families of arguments for God's existence. So, for example, we have the cosmological arguments, which we're going to get into, and these argue for the existence of a personal creator God from examining what? The cosmos, hence cosmological argument, right? So they look at the universe and try to follow a certain line of thinking back to the conclusion that it's reasonable to assume that a personal creator God exists, and he is the most rational explanation for the existence of the universe. So you have the cosmological argument family. Well, then you also have the moral argument family. And these are a series of arguments that basically examine the existence of moral law, objective morality, objective moral law, that exists within the heart of every man, woman, and child throughout history. Even folks that really don't believe in that, they still do exemplify and live according to some kind of a moral standard or principle, and you can reason back from that to the existence of God as well. So you have the cosmological family of arguments, the moral, or you can also say axiological family of arguments. Then you have a very popular family of philosophical arguments for God's existence, and these are called the teleological family, or you could say the design arguments. And these are very colorful today. I think that this family, especially today, is very powerful because we're in an age of science where we have tools that are better than ever before. And so you could speak about the design of the universe in terms of the language of physics. You could speak about it in terms of the terrestrial design that we see involving the planet Earth and what kind of design features are necessary to support complex biological life. Or you could also look at it at the microscopic biological level. You could look at the design aspects of bacterial flagellum, the blood clotting mechanisms, the cellular design, things like this. So the design argument is very, very powerful today. There's other arguments we'll examine, as I mentioned in a previous video. The conceptual argument for God's existence. We might talk about the argument for God's existence from consciousness, and then something called properly basic beliefs, which I'm studying that more myself. It's pretty interesting and sometimes complex, but Dr. Alvin Plantinga, he has written really all the foundational material on that, and so we'll get into that as well. So for today, we're going to get into the cosmological argument for God's existence. As I said, this is a family of arguments, meaning it's a family. There's different versions of the cosmological argument for God's existence. One of the versions that we'll talk about in the future is called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's probably the shortest, the easiest to remember, and it's probably the most popular today. Why? Well, because Dr. William Lane Craig, one of the foremost defenders of the Christian faith, he has made it popular. The Kalam cosmological argument. Or we could also talk about the Thomistic argument, the Thomistic cosmological argument for God's existence. This argues back to a first unmoved mover as the explanation for the universe. But today we're actually going to get into what people call the Leibnizian cosmological argument. Why? Well, this is from a gentleman named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. This is a German man. He's from the 1700s. And this is a cosmological argument from contingency. And what that means is it argues back to God by looking at the cosmos and realizing that what we see in the universe around us are basically contingent objects. And the universe itself appears to be a definite contingent object. I'll explain what that is. It's basically just a dependent object. It is not the source for its own existence. It owes its own existence to something else. That makes it a contingent or a dependent object. So this is called the cosmological argument from contingency. Let me just read through the three premises and the one conclusion of the argument, and then we'll continue it next week. Premise number one of this argument: everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Well, premise number two would be that if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Premise number three would be the universe exists, and the conclusion would therefore be the explanation of the universe is God. So we'll go through that next time when we get together, because I've spoken quite a bit. I apologize. And what we're going to begin to do is then analyze each of the premises, and we're going to try to see if we can find a flaw or a weakness inside of any of these premises. That's how you actually defeat a deductive argument. You're trying to find a mistake, a flaw, an error in some of the premises. But here's the catch. In a deductive argument, I'll explain what that is in our next video, if there are no mistakes, if it is logically airtight, then the conclusion follows necessarily and inescapably from the premises, and there's nowhere to go. So we'll go through this argument, we'll examine it premise by premise, It's very short, guys. You can memorize it, and then you can use it as a great tool the next time you get into a conversation about God's existence. Really do encourage you guys to keep tuning in, and tracking with us as we go through these arguments for God's existence. So I'll see you next time. Until then, have an intelligent faith.